right, so today we are diving deep into Prince Harry's autobiography, Spare.
Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and get this, we're actually looking at excerpts from the Italian translation.
Okay, how interesting. Does that change the perspective at all, looking at a translation?
You know, it's almost like having like a reflection of a reflection. It reveals these subtle nuances, you know, almost like you're getting a different angle on the story.
Very cool.
But for today, let's really try to unpack, I guess, the experiences that made Harry who he is, especially, you know, his relationships, inner struggles, all of that.
Yeah, I think those reflections really give us some insight into that. Right off the bat, Harry seems to be wrestling with this idea of being the spare, which, you know, kind of becomes a theme throughout the whole book.
It's almost like he's like aware of his role as like the backup, even from really young age.
Right.
He even mentions this this comment from his father, like almost a joke, but now you've given me an heir and a spare, my work is done.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even unpack that?
I mean, it's kind of a lot to unpack, right? It really speaks to this deeply ingrained hierarchy within the royal family. But it wasn't just about, you know, titles and all that. Harry even talks about, like, potentially being an organ donor for William if something were to happen.
Oh, wow.
It's a bit unsettling, right? Like, his whole existence was sort of tied to his brother's well-being in this really, really intense way.
That's like a whole other level of pressure to grow up with. And you kind of see how that pressure may be played out in his relationship with William, which he describes as this beloved brother, his nemesis kind of thing.
Right. Very complex. One thing that really stuck with me was how Harry noticed William, like, physically not looking as much like their mother, Diana, as time went on.
Yeah.
Like, even their shared grief was, like, shifting and changing them in different ways.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful. It really shows how complicated their bond was, especially with, you know, losing their mom so young. And speaking of Diana's death, we can't really talk about Harry's story without addressing that. Like, his account of that day is just, it's still so raw, even after all these years.
He talks about how he just couldn't believe it at first. He was, like, clinging to this hope that Diana had somehow staged the whole thing, like a way to escape the paparazzi and the press and just disappear.
Yeah.
It really highlights, you know, the kind of pressure she was under, but also just how much Harry struggled to process this, like, unimaginable event at such a young age.
I can't even imagine being that young and dealing with that kind of loss. And then that image of him walking behind her coffin with the whole world watching.
It's a powerful image.
It's like this really heavy reminder of how that trauma never really leaves you. Like Diana's death, it wasn't just a loss. It was this, like, this scar, you know, that kind of shaped who he became.
Totally. And that sense of loss, it kind of bleeds into his teenage years, especially at Eton. He talks about, like, struggling to write, feeling this intense pressure to do well in school, always being compared to William, who seemed to, like, breeze through it all.
It's like he was constantly under a microscope, always being measured against his brother. You really start to see in those years how he starts searching for, like, a place to belong, you know, like a purpose. And this is where I think his time in the military becomes really important to the story.
Yeah, totally. It's in the military, especially his time in Botswana, where Harry seems to find this sense of freedom, you know, like a sense of belonging that he hadn't really felt anywhere else. The way he describes the African landscape, it's like there's this tenderness there, this familiarity, almost like he feels truly connected to it.
It seems like Africa, for Harry, was this kind of sanctuary, a place to heal, to reflect.
Yeah.
Maybe even find some spiritual grounding.
It sounds like he really needed that connection to Africa. Like, it was such a world away from, you know, the royal life, all the expectations. He let him be, well, I guess, more himself.
Right. And it's like, no matter how far you go, even Africa, you can't really outrun those cameras, those tabloids. Especially when you're a royal.
Yeah.
He really doesn't hold back about how much that scrutiny got to him either. Like, there's this one part, he talks about being chased by paparazzi in London, actually fearing for his life.
It's scary to think about.
It is. And it wasn't just like his physical safety, you know, it was like this constant invasion into his headspace too. Like, he tells this story about a tabloid accusing him of using drugs, just completely made up. And he felt like he had to come out and deny it, you know, publicly. Just shows you how much power those tabloids have, how easily they can twist things around.
Yeah, and what that does to a person having to defend yourself against lies like that.
Exactly. So it makes sense that Harry would look for, like, genuine connections, you know. And that brings us to Meghan Markle. The way he describes meeting her is like this instant spark, like she helped him see everything in a new light.
He talks about her almost as like this catalyst, not just a girlfriend, but someone who pushed him to grow.
Right. And he knew going in that the media would be all over her, joining the royal family and all. But it seems like he couldn't imagine facing any of it without her.
And sadly, the press, they weren't exactly welcoming to Meghan, were they?
No. He's really honest about the racism, the double standards she had to deal with. Stuff that, honestly, other newcomers to the royal family just didn't.
It makes you think about all that unconscious bias, and how the media just amplifies it.
It's a whole other conversation, really.
Yeah.
But even within the family, you could tell things were getting strained. Harry talks about this distance growing between him and William, like they were on opposite sides of, I don't know, a canyon or something.
And this goes back to that idea of belonging, right? Like, Harry found that with Meghan, and he'd found it before in Africa, but within his own family, it just wasn't there. Especially with all the negativity in the press, it seems like that support was really lacking.
Yeah, and, it makes you think, like, all of that, the pressure, the lack of support, it all kind of led to Harry and Meghan stepping back from royal life.
Right.
Moving to California. It wasn't just about, like, geography. It was like a whole statement, choosing their well-being over, like, tradition, duty, all of that.
It really challenged this whole idea of, like, what it means to be royal. You know, the sacrifices that come with it, the price of that kind of power.
Right. It definitely sparked a global conversation, that's for sure. But you know what I find interesting? Even before that whole, royal exit, there are these little moments in Spare that really give you a sense of Harry's inner world. Like he talks about his childhood nanny, Mabel.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of like he remembers her fondly, but then he says she wasn't very good at, like, showing empathy.
Yeah.
Which, after everything we've talked about, it hits different.
Yeah. It's like even the people who were supposed to be there for him emotionally weren't always equipped to do that. It kind of adds another layer to understanding why he craved connection so much, especially later on at Eton.
Exactly. That need for connection comes up again and again. Like, he talks about visiting Eton with his dad, this place that's supposed to be, like, prestigious, full of history, and Harry's just overwhelmed. The work, the expectations, it's all a bit much.
You can tell he felt this pressure to, like, fit this mold, right? To be this perfect student, this perfect royal. And it wasn't just the academics either. There was that whole thing with a tabloid accusing him of plagiarism.
Oh, right.
Which turned out to be totally false, but still, like, that leaves a mark.
I bet. Just goes to show, even when you're living a privileged life, you still have those moments of self-doubt, feeling not good enough, especially compared to a sibling who seems to, like, handle it all so easily.
Totally. And those feelings, they kind of followed him even after Eton, didn't they?
Yeah, it's like he needed to prove himself. And that's where the military comes in again, like this chance to really contribute, to do something on his own terms. And the way he describes combat, his buddies, even being deployed to Afghanistan, you can tell it was really intense.
Transformative.
For sure. He's really upfront about the realities of war, too. Even the hard parts, like having to kill, which, not a lot of people would be willing to talk about that.
It takes a lot of courage to be that honest about those experiences. And it really shows you the weight of it all, the emotional toll that stays with you.
It makes you see his struggles with mental health in a whole new light. But even after everything in Afghanistan, he still faced these setbacks, like being pulled from duty for safety reasons. It really seemed to get to him.
It was like this reminder that no matter what he did, his royal status would always define him in a way.
Yeah, like he couldn't escape it. He wanted to serve with his friends, make a difference. But his birthright, it kind of held him back.
You can feel that tension, between what he felt called to do and what was expected of him.
And this is where I think his relationship with Meghan becomes even more significant. Like, he talks about her being this source of strength, someone who helped him break free from all of that, find his own path.
It's a pretty powerful story when you think about it, finding that kind of love, that support, while dealing with all this external pressure, all those biases.
Definitely. And in the end, stepping back from royal life, creating this new path for their family, it's like the ultimate act of choosing themselves, choosing their own happiness.
It's a story that really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About tradition, about the cost of privilege, and I think ultimately about that universal desire to belong, to find yourself.
That's so true. I mean, this whole deep dive into Spare,
Yeah.
It's been a lot, family, legacy, resilience, but also just The power of choosing your own way. It's definitely something I'll be thinking about for a while.
Me too. It really shows you behind all the headlines, the royal titles, it's just human stories, And sometimes those are the most powerful ones to hear.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into Spare. It's been a wild ride, but we hope you've enjoyed it.